The man with the legal right to act looked at the cost, shook his head, and walked away. He was not a villain. He was not cruel. He simply did the calculation and decided the price was too high for him personally. No one at the gate that morning condemned him. The law gave him the right to refuse, and he used it. He took off his sandal, handed it over, and stepped out of the story. The Bible never records his name. The man standing next to him was ready. He had already gathered 10 witnesses. He had already prepared what he was going to say. He had thought through every legal detail and every possible outcome, including the one where the other man said yes and he had to step aside. He had been prepared for that too. But the other man said no, and so Boaz stepped forward. What he did next placed his name in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. But to understand why that matters, you have to understand who Boaz was before he ever sat down at that gate. Because this story does not begin on the morning of the legal proceeding. It begins a generation earlier, with a woman in a city called Jericho, and a red cord hanging from a window in a wall that was about to fall. If you are watching this for the first time, subscribe now so you never miss a story like this one. The book of Ruth introduces Boaz in chapter 2 with one sentence. He was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of standing, whose name was Boaz. The Hebrew phrase translated as man of standing is ish gibber chayil. It appears in the book of Judges to describe warriors of exceptional character and strength. It was not a courtesy title. It was a description that a community gave to someone after years of watching how he lived. Boaz owned fields outside Bethlehem. He employed workers, men and women, supervised by a foreman. His harvests were large enough to require a significant workforce. When he walked through the city gate, people recognized him. When he spoke at the gate, elders listened. But there is something in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, that reshapes everything we read about Boaz before we even begin. Matthew writes that Salmon was the father of Boaz, and that Boaz's mother was Rahab. That name would have stopped anyone in Bethlehem cold. Rahab was from Jericho. She was a Canaanite woman, a foreigner by birth and by blood, who had heard stories about what the God of Israel had done in Egypt and across the wilderness. When 2 spies sent by Joshua arrived in Jericho before the conquest, she hid them at great personal risk. She had not seen the plagues. She had not crossed the Red Sea. She had only heard, and on the basis of what she heard, she made a decision. She hung a red cord from her window and put her life and her family's lives in the hands of a God she had not yet fully known. When the walls fell and Jericho was destroyed, her household alone was brought out safely and absorbed into the people of Israel. The New Testament does not quietly move past her history. Hebrews chapter 11 puts her name in the list of the faithful alongside Abraham, Moses, and Gideon. James chapter 2 points to her as an example of faith that showed itself through action. Matthew chapter 1 places her in the lineage of Jesus without a word of explanation or apology. Boaz grew up knowing all of this about his mother. He grew up in a home shaped by a woman who had come from entirely outside the covenant of Israel and been brought in by a God who keeps his word. The Bible does not tell us directly what Rahab taught her son, but we can watch what kind of man Boaz became. And what we see in him is deeply consistent with being raised by a woman who understood from personal experience what it meant to be a stranger received with grace. To follow this story, you need to understand one institution in the law of Moses. The Hebrew word is goel, and it is usually translated as kinsman redeemer. If a man in Israel fell into poverty so severe that he had to sell his ancestral land, his nearest male relative had both the right and the responsibility to buy that land back and keep it within the family. A related law in Deuteronomy chapter 25 addressed widows. If a married man died without children, his nearest male relative was expected to marry the widow and raise up children in the dead man's name. This ensured that the man's name would not disappear from Israel, and that his widow would not be abandoned without provision. These were not romantic customs. They were legal structures built to protect the most vulnerable people in Israelite society. A widow without children had no inheritance, no economic standing, and no one legally responsible for her care in old age. The Goel system was God's provision for exactly that situation. Naomi had returned to Bethlehem from Moab after the deaths of her husband Elimelech and both of her sons, Mahlon and Chilion. She had come back with her Moabite daughter-in-law Ruth, a foreign woman with no standing in Israel. There was a piece of land that had belonged to Elimelech. It now needed to be redeemed. The closest kinsman to Naomi had the first claim. The book of Ruth never records his name. He was ahead of Boaz in the family line. The law placed his right before Boaz's right. Boaz knew this, and knowing it, shaped every decision he made in the weeks that followed. Ruth went out one morning to glean. The law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 19 and Deuteronomy chapter 24 required farmers to leave the corners of their fields unharvested, not to go back over a field a second time, and not to pick up grain that fell during the harvest. These portions were left deliberately for the poor, for foreigners, for widows and orphans. The person in need had to go and gather it themselves. But the law ensured there was something to gather. Ruth did not know whose field she was entering. Ruth chapter 2, verse 3 says she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. The Hebrew word there, mikre, is sometimes translated as chance. From Ruth's perspective that morning, she simply walked into a field. The text leaves the reader to sit with what might have been guiding her steps. Boaz arrived at his fields and greeted his workers. "The Lord be with you." They answered back, "The Lord bless you." This was not a formal prayer recited at the start of a workday. This was the ordinary language of a man whose faith was not stored somewhere separate from the rest of his life. It came out naturally, because it was genuinely there. He saw Ruth among the workers and asked his foreman who she was. The foreman told him plainly, "She is the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from Moab. She asked permission to glean and has been working since morning." Boaz walked over to her himself. Not a message through the foreman, not a nod from a distance. He went to her directly, and what he said to her went well past anything the law asked of him. He told her not to glean in any other field. He told her to stay close to his female workers for the entire harvest season. He told the young men working for him not to touch her. He told her to drink from the water jars his workers had filled whenever she was thirsty. Ruth bowed low to the ground and asked why he was treating her this way, since she was a foreigner. The weight in that word was real. She was not simply from another region. She was from Moab, a nation that the law of Moses had specifically excluded from the assembly of Israel. Boaz's answer in Ruth chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, is the clearest view we have into who this man was. He said, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." He had already heard her story before she arrived in his field. He knew about the choice she had made at the border of Moab, when she could have turned back and did not. He knew about her loyalty to Naomi. And when he described God's protection, he reached for the image of wings, a bird covering its young. He was not describing himself. He was pointing her toward God as the source of the shelter she had come looking for. At mealtime, he called her to eat with his workers. She ate until she was full and had some left over. Then when she went back to glean, he gave his workers quiet instructions to pull out stalks from the bound sheaves deliberately and leave them on the ground where she would find them. None of this was what the law required. The law said leave the corners and what falls. Boaz did far more than that. When Ruth came home that evening, Naomi saw immediately that something unusual had happened. The amount of grain was far beyond what a normal day of gleaning produced. When Ruth told her it had been the field of Boaz, Naomi's response was quick. "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And then she said something that shifted the tone of the whole conversation. "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Redeemers. The word goel. In one breath, Naomi moved from gratitude to recognition. The man who had just shown extraordinary care to her daughter-in-law was also the man who held legal standing to act on behalf of the family. These two facts were not separate. They were pointing in the same direction. Ruth continued gleaning through the full barley harvest and then through the wheat harvest. Months passed. The fields emptied. And when the harvests were over and the threshing was complete, Naomi came to Ruth with a plan. She told her to go to the threshing floor that night, after the harvest celebration, after Boaz had eaten and lain down. She told her to come in the dark, to uncover his feet, and to lie down at them. She said he would tell her what to do. Ruth came to the threshing floor after dark. She waited while Boaz ate and drank, and his heart was merry, as the text says. She watched where he lay down at the edge of the grain pile. She came quietly across the floor. She uncovered his feet. She lay down. She waited in the dark. She did not know what he would say. She did not know if he would be angry or embarrassed or simply turn over and ignore her. She lay at his feet in the middle of the night in a place she was not supposed to be and waited. At midnight, Boaz startled awake. Something had disturbed him. He sat up and turned and felt, rather than saw, that there was someone at his feet. The text says he was startled. He looked and could not make out who it was in the dark. He asked, "Who are you?" She said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Stop and sit with those words for a moment. In the field, weeks earlier, Boaz had told Ruth that she had come to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. Now, on the threshing floor at midnight, she was using his exact word back to him. She was asking him to become, in human form, the shelter he had pointed her toward. She was asking him to step into what the law already made possible, to move from observing her situation to acting within it. What Boaz said next showed the kind of man he was, both in what he offered and in what he refused to conceal. He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." He saw her coming to him not as a woman acting from desperation, but as a woman acting with integrity. He called it hesed, faithful kindness. And then he told her what he did not have to tell her. He said, "It is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." He could have accepted her appeal and said nothing about the closer kinsman. The darkness would have covered that silence easily. Instead, he told the truth, and he committed to seeing the proper process through. He told her, "If the closer kinsman will redeem you, let him do it. But if he is not willing, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you." He gave her 6 measures of barley to carry back to Naomi before she left. Because, he said, She should not return to her mother-in-law empty-handed. He was already thinking about the whole picture. He was already caring for Naomi through this moment. Boaz went up to the city gate the next morning without delay. The gate of Bethlehem was where public life became legally real. Disputes were settled here. Transactions were confirmed here. A man's word spoken at the gate, in front of witnesses and elders, was binding. Whatever happened at the gate stayed on record in the memory of the community. He saw the closer kinsman coming through and called out to him by name. He asked him to sit. Then he gathered 10 elders of the city, the number required for a legally valid proceeding under the customs of the time. He laid the matter out clearly and honestly. Naomi had returned from Moab and was offering the parcel of land that had belonged to Elimelech. The right of redemption belonged first to this man, and Boaz was next. He asked him directly whether he intended to redeem it. The man said yes. He would buy the land. Then Boaz added the second part. He said, "The day you acquire the field from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." The closer kinsman's answer shifted. He said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I damage my own inheritance. You take the right of redemption. I cannot do it." Buying the land alone would have been a clean transaction. Land purchased, land owned, land passed to his children. But taking Ruth as well meant that the children raised from that marriage would legally carry Mahlon's name. The land bought with his money would pass to heirs who bore a dead man's name, not his. The legal and financial complexity was one he was not prepared to absorb. So he removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz. This was the ancient custom described in Ruth chapter 4. To transfer a legal right publicly, a man gave his sandal to the other party. It was visible, symbolic, and irreversible. Everyone standing at the gate saw it happen. And in front of the 10 elders and the assembled people, Boaz declared, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Mahlon and Chilion. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have taken to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that his name may not be cut off from his brothers and from the gate of his native place." The people said, "We are witnesses." And the elders spoke a blessing that reached back to Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel, and to Tamar, who bore Perez in the line of Judah. These names were not ornamental. The community was placing this moment inside the long, continuous story of what God had been doing among his people. They were saying, "What is happening at this gate this morning belongs to that same story." Boaz and Ruth were married, and the Lord gave Ruth conception. She bore a son. The women of Bethlehem gathered around Naomi. They said to her, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." And Naomi took the child and held him against her chest. Think about where she had been. She had walked out of Bethlehem years earlier with a husband and 2 sons. She had buried all 3 of them in a foreign country. When she came back across the border, she had told the women who ran to meet her, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, bitter. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." She had not been wrong about the loss. The grief was real. The emptiness was real. She had looked at her life and described it accurately from where she was standing. But she could not see yet what was already in motion around her. She could not see the field her daughter-in-law would walk into that morning. She could not see the man who would look up from his work, ask a question, and cross the distance between himself and a foreign widow without hesitation. She could not see the threshing floor, or the gate, or the sandal. Now she was sitting in Bethlehem with a grandson pressed against her. And the women of the neighborhood were saying that his name would be renowned in Israel. His name was Obed. His son was Jesse. Jesse's son was David. There is a moment in the field that reveals Boaz more clearly than any summary of his qualities could. When he arrived that morning and noticed Ruth among the workers, he did not send a message through his foreman. He went to her himself. He covered the social distance between a wealthy landowner and a foreign widow without hesitating over it. He spoke to her with his own voice. He handed her bread with his own hand. He had enough standing that a word to the foreman would have been entirely sufficient. And he chose direct human contact instead. And then, on the threshing floor, alone in the dark, with no one watching, he told the truth about the closer kinsman when silence would have cost him nothing. He followed the correct legal process at the gate the next morning, honoring the other man's right even while hoping he would decline and being prepared to accept either result. A person's actual character appears most clearly in the moments when nothing external is requiring it. Boaz behaved with the same consistency at midnight, on the threshing floor that he showed in front of 10 elders in broad daylight. The Hebrew word chayil that describes him does not simply mean wealth or position. It means a kind of strength that holds its shape across every circumstance, private and public, convenient and costly. The Hebrew word, he said, runs through the book of Ruth like a thread. It appears 3 times, and no single English word catches its full weight. Loving kindness is one translation. Steadfast love is another. Loyal faithfulness is a third. None of them quite reaches it. Hesed is not primarily an emotion. It is faithfulness expressed through action, the kind that continues even when it is inconvenient, even when the cost is real, even when no one would blame you for stopping. It does not calculate the return on the investment. It simply keeps going. Naomi uses the word to describe what God and Ruth had shown her. Ruth embodies it through her refusal to leave Naomi at the border. Boaz lives it out in the field, on the threshing floor, and at the gate. When Boaz told Ruth that she had come to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel, he was speaking out of a household that had lived that reality from the inside. His mother, Rahab, had heard about the God of Israel from a distance and decided to trust him before she had any personal experience of him. She had acted on that trust at real risk, with no guarantee of the outcome. That decision had brought her through the collapse of Jericho and into the community of God's people. The Bible does not tell us what Rahab taught her son in words, but the man she raised was someone who, when a foreign widow showed up in his field, thought immediately of God's wings. That connection is worth sitting with. Centuries after Boaz stepped forward at the gate in Bethlehem, Luke records that a man named Joseph traveled from Nazareth to that same city to be registered, because he was of the house and lineage of David. His wife was with him. She was expecting a child. Matthew chapter 1 traces that child's ancestry from Abraham forward. In verse 5, he names Boaz. In verse 6, he names David. And at the end of the list, in verse 16, he names Jesus, who is called the Messiah. The field where Ruth came to glean one morning, the threshing floor in the dark, the sandal passed between 2 men at the gate, the child held against Naomi's chest. Obed, Jesse, David. The line holds without breaking and arrives. Through every generation, Matthew names, at a birth in that same town of Bethlehem. Now consider what Boaz did alongside what the New Testament calls redemption. There was a condition that the person in it could not undo by herself. There was a proper legal order to follow. The one with the first right stepped back because the personal cost was too high. Someone else stepped forward, counted what it would require, and did it. Paul writes in Galatians chapter 4 that God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. The Greek word for redeem there carries the same weight as the Hebrew goal: to buy back, to restore what had been lost, to bring into the family those who were excluded from it. The book of Ruth is not an allegory. It is a real account of real people. But within that history, a shape appears that the rest of Scripture recognizes and returns to. God redeems. He does it through specific people in specific places at specific moments. And the people he works through are not always the ones who had the first right by birth order. Sometimes they are simply the ones who were ready. So here is the question this story leaves on the table. The closer kinsman was not a wicked man. The text gives him no evil motive. He was simply a man who looked at what faithfulness would cost him personally and decided it was too much. He stepped back. He walked away. And history forgot his name entirely. Boaz counted the same cost and stepped forward. And his name is in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Most of us will never stand at a city gate with 10 elders watching. But the choice those two men faced at that gate is one that appears in ordinary life more often than we tend to notice. There is a moment when someone near us needs something we have the capacity to give. Time, provision, a word spoken on their behalf, an inconvenient commitment honored when it would have been easy to let it quietly expire. The law, in most of those moments, does not require us to act. No one would blame us for stepping back. The cost is real and the complications are personal. That is precisely the moment where character becomes visible. The book of Ruth is not a story about two people finding each other. It is a story about what faithful love looks like when it is expressed through action rather than sentiment. Boaz did not declare his feelings. He changed Ruth's circumstances. He did not offer warm words from a distance. He closed the distance himself, spoke her name, handed her bread, gathered witnesses, and made a public legal commitment that he kept. And notice what he never said. He never reminded Ruth what this was costing him. He never mentioned what he was giving up by honoring Mahlon's name over his own interests. He never asked for acknowledgement of his sacrifice. He simply did what his said required and kept moving. The question the story asks us is not whether we find Boaz admirable. The question is whether, when the moment arrives in our own lives, we are the person who has already done the work, who is already at the gate, who is already prepared, or whether we are the one who calculates the personal cost and quietly hands over the sandal. Naomi came home empty. She came home calling herself bitter. And God did not answer her grief with an explanation. He answered it with a field, a harvest, a man at a gate, and a child placed in her arms. That is how God often moves, not through announcements, but through the faithfulness of ordinary people in ordinary places who choose to act when nothing requires it of them. Boaz performs no miracles in this story. He does not survive a furnace or a lion's den. He does not call fire from the sky or part a river. What he does is quieter. And perhaps that is exactly the point. Because most of us will not be asked to do the dramatic thing. Most of us will be asked to do the faithful thing. The thing that costs something real. The thing no one is requiring. The thing that happens in a field before sunrise, or on a threshing floor at midnight, or at a gate where only 10 people are watching. Boaz was ready when the moment came. Not because he was extraordinary by nature, but because he had been shaped by a God whose faithfulness he had seen up close from childhood. His mother had been brought in from the outside. He had watched what it looked like when God keeps a promise to someone with no claim to it. And when a foreign widow appeared in his field, something in him already knew what to do. That same God is still in the business of keeping promises, still working through specific people in specific places, still looking for the one who has done the work, who is already at the gate, who is already prepared to act when the moment arrives. The book of Ruth is 4 chapters. There are no battles in it, no plagues, no appearances of fire or cloud. There is a famine that ends, a journey, 2 widows, a field, a harvest, a threshing floor at night, a gate in the morning, a sandal, and a child held against an old woman's chest in Bethlehem. Naomi came home calling herself empty, and God answered that emptiness not with a speech, but with a grandson on her lap and women around her saying his name would be renowned in Israel. If you are carrying something that feels like emptiness right now, this story is worth holding on to. Not because it promises that everything resolves quickly or cleanly, but because it shows how God moves, quietly, through faithful people, through ordinary fields and ordinary mornings, toward an ending that the people living inside the story could not yet see. And the name Boaz is in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, not because of the scale of what he did, but because when a foreign woman who had placed her trust in the God of Israel came to his field, he treated her with the same faithfulness he had himself received from that God. His mother had been Rahab. He had seen from childhood what grace looked like when it passed through a human life into the next one. When the moment came in his own life, he did not hesitate. That is the story of Boaz, a man who was not obligated, a man who was ready, a man whose name is written in the line that leads to Bethlehem. If this story spoke to you today, please leave a like. It helps more people find these stories. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. Tell us what stayed with you most, whether it was Rahab and what her life meant for the kind of man Boaz became, the tension of the threshing floor, the legal drama at the gate, or the quiet way God answered Naomi's grief. We read every comment. May you be the person who shows up prepared when the moment comes. May you choose faithfulness when nothing requires it of you. And may the God who answered Naomi's grief with a child on her lap answer whatever you are carrying today with the same quiet, unbreakable faithfulness. God bless you, and we will see you in the next video.